Okay, it looks like we are ready to go. Marguerite, we good to go?
Yep, that sounds good.
Okay, awesome. So thanks everyone for joining today again on a Friday. I really appreciate it. I know this might be some spring breaks going on and stuff, so we appreciate you being here, and we're really excited about what we're sharing today, particularly the analysis portion. So you should have received an email from me with an Excel sheet earlier today. If you did not receive that email, go ahead and you can write in the question box, or you can send me an email and I can get that over to you before we get to that portion of the call today. But it will probably just be helpful to have that in front of you as we go through some of that analysis, because it's kind of detailed. So today we're going to talk about common reporting standards. But as always, just the communication norms, if you have questions or want to make a comment, go ahead and use your comment or question box. And if you want to be unmuted so you can participate verbally, just do the raised hand function on the right side of your screen, and we will unmute you so that you can contribute.
Sorry, I wasn't advancing the slides. That's my fault. All right, but I know that you know this, so just a reminder. But go ahead, Katie. Sorry about that.
No problem. Okay, so our agenda today, we're going to talk about first why it's important to seek common reporting standards. We've talked about this the last couple of calls, so we'll kind of go over it in a little bit more detail today, that why portion. And then we're going to do kind of running the numbers. We have some examples from Wyoming and Mississippi, so we'll go through those as well. That's that Excel document that I sent out this morning. Then we'll go over kind of what's not captured in the financials. What did we learn when we did this analysis that might be useful to you all? And then we'll talk about in the analysis, what is useful? What do you actually care about seeing? And then we have a really, really brief survey at the end. Some of our funders have asked us to collect some basic information from you all about the usefulness of some of this stuff. And so we'll do that quick survey at the end, and we'd appreciate it if you could stay on and do that. It'll take like 2 minutes.
Wonderful. So we said that we together, and this was kind of in response to all of you, was that we wanted to have some kind of common reporting standards. Maybe they'd be optional, but that the goal would be useful comparisons across schools. And so we started thinking about that and thought, that led us toward what end, like for what purpose? So we can, we're all at risk of producing lots of data that doesn't have any value to people. And if we were going to go through this exercise, we wanted to at least start it off with what would be the value, what's the purpose of it? What do we think people would do with it that had some value? So we blocked out kind of 3 different areas. One was so that, you have financial data across schools, across states, that might help you think about resource allocation and potentially equity. That's been something that's thrown around a lot with this. So are districts divvying up their funds fairly? We'd be able to see that. Do policies and practices shortchange some types of schools? Are some locales underfunded relative to their peers? But the idea here is really to inform or potentially ultimately affect decisions about how much money is deployed to each district or to each school. So that's kind of the equity. And I have 2 more boxes to give you. And what you're going to see is kind of a text heavy slide here, but bear with me, we're going to come back to this a little bit later. And we just wanted to have this so it was parked in this PowerPoint and you could potentially use it later. But the second area would be efficiency. And efficiency is when we talk about are there object or function costs, and we want to compare how much they are across schools or districts, how much are they spending on similar services, inputs, are they able to get benefits at a lower rate, or transportation or something like that? Is there waste? Can we spend less for the same service? Are there innovative ways to deliver something that allow it to spend less? And the goal here, we thought, would be to spend money more efficiently. And so those of you who know me know that I don't love that word, but we put it up here anyway. Potentially reduce waste, maybe free up money for something else. So that would be the other kind of value in having this data and having it out there and having it be comparable. And potentially the third one is productivity. And that is, how do you leverage your existing funds for greater outcomes? So you're trying to seek greater outcomes with the money that you have. And there are a whole list of questions here to what level of outcomes for a school is possible at any given spending level. How do one school's outcomes compare to others with the same level of funding? Should a school be getting greater outcomes with the funds on hand? What spending choices are those who do get greater outcomes? Will knowing what's possible in terms of outcomes at a given spending level drive school effects? Or, in other words, will simply knowing that other schools spend the same amount of money that you have and get greater outcomes, will that drive a behavioral change inside schools where people sort of scramble or work harder or raise their expectations about what's possible? Are there innovations out there, big innovations, on how a school operates that can produce greater outcomes at a similar cost? Maybe by redefining functions altogether. Maybe they go to school a different number of days a week or different months of the year, or kids do completely different things, and instead of like have a whole bunch of 10-year-olds in a classroom for 9 months or something. Maybe there are big innovations coming down the pike, but we can't even examine those innovations unless we know the spending and the outcomes that go with them. And then the goal here is for schools and districts to strive to get greater outcomes, either by working harder or differently, or spending their money differently. And that's that goal. So these are three big areas. And I wonder if for any of you, if you have a sense of like, is something missing here? Is there another purpose that's missing? And I'll pause for a second, but I also know there's a lot of information and we're going to come back to this. So just either you can throw something out now or throw something out later if you're thinking about this one. Anything else, you can raise your hand or type a question or a comment in there. Okay, so these are the big purposes. Maybe you don't have as much interest in all three purposes, but these are the ones we could sort of tease out, and ones that we've seen along the way. And I do want to take 1 second to define the difference between efficiency and productivity. I know we've done this before as a group, but when we talk about efficiency, we're really talking about inputs, like in this equation of what level of inputs give us what level of outcomes. Can we drive down the cost of the inputs somehow? And that could free up money, which would then drive up the outcomes, but you're really mostly focusing on this cost side of the equation, and that's generally what the word efficiency means. And productivity is really this numerator. How do you take whatever level of inputs you have and drive up the outcomes? So you're either way, the ratio is going up, but one is really working on the denominator and the other one's working on the numerator. And you might be able to say, for this given level of spending, how can I get greater outcomes? That's the productivity part. But we just wanted to make sure we looked at both of these and had a common set of language around that. So as Katie said, we thought, first step, why don't we go and look at the data that we have available? Many of you have generously posted data on given it to Katie or posted on our blog, which has given us a rich database to go like try things out, like what's possible here, and try them out in multiple states. And we did exactly that. We said, all right, if we're going to start pulling numbers across data sets from different states, what do those numbers look like? How doable is it? How possible is it? How hard it is? So this is now the part of the presentation where we run some numbers. So just visualize our team sitting around for days on end, typing away with spreadsheets, not at home, but still we were getting a lot done. And we started looking at these numbers. This is the meme part of our presentation, by the way, today. And I'll tell you that Katie and Tim on our team worked hard at this and started to say, like, what can we pull out? And how can we group information? We ended up looking at, we looked at several data sets beyond the ones we're going to show today. For a couple reasons, we chose to look at, to bring today Wyoming and Mississippi. And what you'll see is that we started off with kind of a base level of information. We said, here's an elementary school, here's a district in Wyoming, and what in the data set that exists right now is coded to the school and what's coded to central. we took the central money, just divided it across all the students, and you can see there that it's the same dollar number for the district as it is for the school. And we're gonna share these slides. We're gonna take the names off of these so they don't, you know, get misused. We don't want to overrepresent the data that we have. And we also look to see for the total money, you know, could you break it up by federal and state and local? And along these elements, they were able to. The data set was able to do that. We also picked out a district in Mississippi, did the same thing. We have a school and a district, and really good success on being able to pull those funds out and report those averages. So what you'll see is that, you know, in the first one in Wyoming, the elementary school there is spending a total of $18,000 per pupil, which is higher than the district, so it's supposed to be a slightly more expensive school. And that a good chunk of the money is actually coded to the school. If we look over at the Mississippi district, you'll see that same thing. We happen to pick a random elementary school that gets a higher spending per school than the district average. And at this moment, we don't really know why. But this is the sort of the baseline numbers we pulled out. And then we decided to go deeper and deeper and see what we could get. So the next thing we pulled out, what we'll call this box B, was enrollments. And they're not in the financial file. So it's one of the things we first have to figure out. And not every state has, you know, the same categories that they would have. But at a minimum, we can see how many kids are at the school. And that's what we use to calculate the numbers above. And sure enough, you can see that the one on the left is a relatively small elementary school. And you can see the size of the districts and so on. We know we can get the Mississippi numbers for the breakouts for these student types, but we didn't have them at the time, you know, by this morning, so, or we just hadn't input them yet. So just in a handy way, you can see that this is a little bit harder step to kind of get the breakout of enrollment types. And then the next step is expenditures by student type. Now here again, this is not something that's always available to be able to categorize what was spent or allocated on behalf of at-risk kids or bilingual. Sometimes these numbers are easily trackable to programs, but not always. And so we did our best and kind of pulled these out. And as you can see in Mississippi, we had a harder time in the data set just pulling out these figures. And only got some of them from the data set in Wyoming. So it gets a little trickier when you get down to this level. And before I move on to the additional boxes, that's what we call box C, expenditures by student type. I thought I would stop and see if you have any questions. Katie and Tim are on, and they're the ones who really spent the last week and a half staring at data files, trying to pull numbers out. And I don't know if you have any questions here or comments, and also want to give a chance for the Wyoming and Mississippi people to weigh in if you think there's something worth pointing out.
Hey, this is Katie. I just wanted to point out too at the bottom, the expenditures by student type. You know, you could do this multiple ways. We decided to do it by enrollment in that particular subgroup. So you can see, for example, in the Wyoming district, you can, the at-risk dollars are divided by the FRL enrollment for that particular school, and then kind of multiplied and reallocated to get that total. So you can just kind of see how that, or sorry, the total was the 404, and then we divided by the enrollment for at-risk. So that average is higher than the district average because those district dollars are then divided by the enrollment at the district level to get kind of that district average total. So we did it all by enrollment by subgroup, but you know, you could break it up by total enrollment in the district or the school, kind of however you would want to.
Yeah, and I flagged that as an issue for you all, which is that the when you do a per pupil expenditure by student type, do you do that and put the denominator for all pupils, or do you put that pupil type? If you do the latter, again, with spelling error there, but if you do the latter, then the per pupil expenditures cannot sum, which probably makes sense. But we shouldn't assume that every state would make the same choice on that. And you can see here that we thought maybe states could make different choices and just mark which choice they did. So if they don't have like special ed enrollment that they're using, or they might just say, here's the amount we spend for all kids on special ed, meaning like it's almost like the not per special ed student amount, but rather this is kind of the fee across all students for the special ed program, whether the students participated in it or not. And those are two different ways of doing this. One is kind of more of an insurance sort of a framework where everybody pays the same fee, regardless of whether you use the services. And the other one is what did it cost to serve those kids? And they have different implications, but we sort of thought maybe the idea is that you just mark which one you did. I don't know, do you guys have any thoughts on that?
So hold on, we have Kim Morrow. Go ahead and unmute. Should be unmuted, Kim.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. So obviously this is our data, so we were looking at it, and I was wondering where you got those expenditure amounts specifically tied to at-risk. Because I'll just preface this that not all districts probably code in the same way, like to an at-risk function code. So I guess maybe I should let you guys respond to that.
Yeah, you're raising the exact issues. These are the kinds of things that once we go run the numbers, they sort of become obvious to us. Like, oh yeah, they may or may not do that. And you can see, like, we know that some of these schools have special ed programs or something, but we may not have the information coded in these categories that way.
Right.
Katie or Tim, do you want to say a few words about this?
Well,
yeah. So we.
Go ahead.
Oh, go ahead, Kim.
I was just going to make one more comment about the special ed. So if you specifically pulled out our special ed function codes, which are 1210 and maybe 2230, we have special education costs are allowed to be coded throughout the whole chart of accounts, and then districts are reimbursed on another report that they submit. So they might not have coded some special ed related costs to the true function codes. So that's the other area that is just a continuation of what we said about the at-risk. So I'll let you talk now, Katie. So
yeah, I'll just say we just went by the names of the function codes. So
right.
For special education, we did pull out 1210. We didn't add in the 2230, and then for the at-risk we pulled 1260. So it was more illustrative. I appreciate you saying no, we're not capturing all the dollars there. That definitely makes sense.
Right, and with changes implemented because of ESSA, so we're asking districts, for one thing, in our other funds, like you probably saw, we have where we run our federal programs, our special revenue, and anything non-general. Districts used to be able to report to a roll-up. So for example, if they were reporting at risk, they could report it to 1200. So we have now changed that going forward effective July 1, that no, you have to use your broken out function codes, because we can't tell 1200 if it's a special ed cost or an at-risk cost or whatever. So with this data, we didn't have that implemented yet. So there could be a lot of at-risk money, Title I money, whatever, that could be coded to 1200. And if you were looking for 1260, you would only get, I think we figured half of the districts coded in that much detail.
Yeah, I think it's going to be a big, really hard. I think that these data sets are actually ahead of the norm, right? So there's going to be a lot of places that say, I'm putting data together that's not going to be allowing me to do that, or whatever I report, I just don't want people to think that's the only thing spent on at-risk kids, because we just don't track it that way, or we don't, we don't, once it's down at the school level, it's really part of a school-wide formula, so it's not as an expenditure coded for a specific student type. And maybe, yeah, so that, I mean, part of why we ran the numbers is to kind of like
to get the discussion
face
going.
all these issues, right?
Right. Yeah.
Yeah. We learned a lot from this. Like, with a number of times we're like, oh yeah, that's going to be an issue. It was over and over. But this is a perfect one, which is, you know, maybe your state has really, really good data and you can fill out box C with reliability. I think the norm will be that box C is going to be a tricky one for people, and maybe one that they do or they don't have a lot of information on. As we started to do that, we realized that you know, the possibility for it to be misleading could be greater than the possibility for it to be sort of reliable. But
yeah, I think,
you know,
box C is scary for us, just
yeah,
so.
if people treated it as a, you know, a work in progress, it's not the only way things are accounted for, you know, maybe it would be worth sharing. And then on the other case, some might say not worth sharing because we're worried that people think we didn't spend any money on our bilingual kids or something.
Right.
I think we got a couple other questions here on this one.
Sure. So I'm going to go ahead and unmute you, Cindy, with Rhode Island.
Okay. I just wanted to say we have the required programs that we track the spending levels on. And then at the same time we're doing our financial data, we're crosswalking with student membership, and we're pulling the program related data as well. And plotting that against all the individual schools as well. So we're taking, for instance, information from the special ed census by the school, and we're able to see within a district where, you know, X number of special ed students are at each school. And so we've got all of that tracked so that we can produce the reports similar to this.
Yeah, that is I think is going to be, you know, I think Rhode Island will probably have one of the richest, most reliable data sets on this, for sure, which I think is in some ways where to start if you want to look at what's possible. And I think, but at the same time, Karma, you raise a terrific issue from New York City, which is how do we know if the expenditures are incremental or not? Because if and this is a great one, we thought about this too, if a special ed student gets a special ed teacher, then the special ed money for that student isn't incremental. It includes their sort of base instructional costs. It's not like they have a spot in the regular ed classroom and a spot in the special ed classroom. They might actually only be in the special ed classroom, which means you don't double spend on them back in the regular ed classroom. And in which case, we don't really know what to make of these special ed numbers. In some cases, they could be incremental, and in some, they could include that student's portion of the base, if I'm accurately reflecting your comment here. And you're right, just makes it really tricky. I think in some ways, and I'm not sure, Weston, if this is what you mean, but some of these might be used for district allocations to schools. And they may or may not actually reflect expenses so much as they were allocations. And again, that makes it super tricky. So I don't know if Weston wants to, if you want to add anything on this.
I think my piece there is if you have a school location that, you know, a principal and a group is managing some people, but those people have 10 students in a classroom, and none of those students actually reflect to the accountability of that actual location, school location. You know, how is there how are we making sure the dollars that are expended in a budget at that school with that budget manager managing those people, really how is the accounting reflecting back out to the accountability if we're really trying to look at dollars per pupil for a specific outcome?
So what do you mean, Weston, that there's students at a school but they don't get counted toward their accountability?
So I'll just say, so example is at IPS, there's an elementary school and it has K through 6 and it has a self-contained classroom. In that self-contained classroom are kids that are located at that school, but for accountability purposes, their tests, grades, and all that, they relate to another school's accountability because they may be boundaried at a specific elementary school, but they actually attend another school just for a self-contained classroom.
Yeah, that's a mess. I don't know.
Yeah, that's the big question I have with, because if we have 1,000 kids that are kind of
Why aren't they just assigned to the school where they go?
To an actual location, but they're actually their accountability grades and all that impact at high school, and the principal doesn't even see 100 of those kids physically, but their grades associate to their letter grade at the state level. The dollars and cents, if you just look at the high school, doesn't take into the whole context the kids that don't exist at that school on a day-to-day basis.
You people in Indiana have your own way of doing things. I don't know.
I realize that. That's comparable between states.
Yeah,
I think, Indiana we need, DOE, which I think is connected to this group now, and I don't know if Melissa's online from the DOE and the team there. There's just a lot of questions we have, and we don't have direction, but I don't know how it's going to be even relevant to do state-by-state comparisons if all the states aren't coding it at all close to the other states.
Well, I think this is why this group includes both districts and SEAs, is to sort of surface those issues, and the issues that need to be surfaced will be different in every state, and that may be one that has to be sort of sorted out in Indiana, which might include, like, how do we decide which students are assigned to which school and which costs are assigned to school, and can we come up with some sort of financial definition that co-locates costs, students, and outcomes? And that way, maybe that means that there's got to be an even greater breakout for that. I don't know. That one is tricky and messy, but I think that might be an Indiana problem more. But it's a great one to raise because so many issues. So that's an issue of student counts, and then the definition of a school, and whether or not outcomes go with that.
If you're in a rural district, and you're, let's say, a county that has one school system, that has one high school, that has one elementary, that has one middle school, it's not going to be an issue because probably that self-contained classroom is in that school. Okay, but when you're an urban district, and I don't know how many of those urban districts are represented on this call, it just gets extremely difficult to equate in the same state dollars to accountability when you have not just 3 locations, let's say, in a school system in a county, but you have 75 locations, or take the larger districts, there are thousands. I mean, it just state by state.
Yeah, but I think
in
other states, even in urban districts, if a student goes to school, let's say out of their neighborhood, and they go to a school because they attend a self-contained classroom, let's say at View Ridge Elementary, then the student is counted at that school. I think what's unusual in Indiana is you're still attributing the accountability results back to a different school that the student goes to. That's unusual. We don't see that in urban areas elsewhere. So but we do have, a lot of rural districts will have problems where, maybe their school district doesn't serve a specific type of student, and they send their money and the kid to a neighboring district. That happens a lot too. So these issues are for sure gonna come up, and I definitely think there's gonna have to have a constant line of communication between the LEAs and the SEA to make sure they all get kind of played out.
Yeah, I mean, my situation in Indianapolis, if there are SEAs on the call and you've networked with Indiana before, and that you're similar to Indiana in some way, feel free to reach out to me, or I can connect you to Melissa Ombre at the Department of Ed. Because if we are that different, then we just need to know that. But if there are other SEAs on the call that can help us, that'd be great.
Well, we may want to at some point, and I know that looks like that we have another comment that there's some similar cases in Gulfport, but we may want to have an entire meeting on how to count students, which I know was originally part of the regulations, but is now out of the regulations, or the regulations are gone.
So we have one more question here. It looks from Deb in Illinois, and I've just gone ahead and unmuted you. So hopefully you can talk now.
Yes, this is Deb from Illinois, and basically I was running into similar problems as I was mocking up one specific school district to just see how we wanted to kind of do it here. And we have categories and a chart of accounts basically that accounts for special ed pre-kindergarten as well as say at-risk pre-kindergarten. And when I was going through this one district, I saw that they had federal funds flow through, which would be the special ed pre-kindergarten, but they didn't have the expenditures in the special ed line. So I'm presuming that they put in all of their pre-kindergarten expenses in the regular pre-kindergarten rather than breaking them out. So that's a problem that we might face here. As far as like what they were talking about in Indiana, we also have some students, special ed students, folk students or something like that, where the school district may tuition them out to another special ed cooperative or area vocational cooperative or something like that. And I was thinking that I didn't want to put those expenditures at the school level because the school wasn't really incurring that cost. But I also got to thinking I don't want to put them at the SEA level because they're not something that should be distributed across all school districts as what I call the overhead cost, administrative cost. So I was wondering if we wanted to designate those as a quote unquote separate school per se from the, the school district kind of thing, so that you can show these are the tuition out students and then account only for those students by the divisor and so forth.
I think that's a smart way of doing it, to kind of say, if the students are tuitioned out, maybe we just call them like private placement or tuitioned out, and they count as a whole separate school. They have their kids and the costs are attributed to them. So
that's how I would,
or the money is listed in this kind of gray exclusions line.
Well, that's one thought I had too. Or do we just show it as excluded costs, but then because a lot of these are special needs students and that, so it would look like maybe your special needs costs were much less than what they really are because some schools may be tuitioning them out. So I kind of hesitated to show that as an excluded cost as well. So I just didn't know thoughts. One other thought as I was going through this as well is some districts are operating at a loss and they may be using prior year fund balances, or they may be going out and borrowing money to meet their operational needs. Right now, I'm showing that because I went through and kind of matched up the state revenue that they're getting in and matched up the federal revenue and put that in the appropriate categories to show those lines in that for local, state, federal, and then what I'm calling private for the donations and fees and so forth. But I got to thinking there are a lot of districts in Illinois that may be using their fund balances or borrowing money to meet operational needs right now. And I wasn't sure, I'm showing that as local right now, but wasn't sure if that was quite correct because we didn't have that fourth category. And districts aren't necessarily maintaining they may be coding the expenditure somewhere, but it might not really be coming in from taxes, true federal, state, or private funds.
Yeah, as loans. Well, I think even loans, if they got to pay back, is state and local. But that is going to be another common one because we do see that a lot. So the expenditures will be in there, but they've taken out debt. So those should be in the expenditures, but not payments. Well, yeah, that's a mess. Yeah. But I think that's going to be also common. I think that would be listed as an expenditure, potentially state. I would put it in state and local, but the payment back to so it'll almost look like they have more money than they have.
Right. Right. Well, because you're going to have your debt payments overall as your SEA expenditure or LEA expenditures, basically, that would be spread overall, and that's where they're paying that back. But yet you have these expenditures that are being made from the proceeds of the debt, if you will,
Right.
And or they're using a prior year fund balance, which they before now have not broken out into state, local, federal, or private sources.
Yeah, I would probably put prior year fund balance and debt in state and local spending as a revenue source. I would put it in state and local, and that's because I think really the point here is to call out federal separately, and so leaving that separate is fine. But I wanted to point out one more thing on here is that we ended up dividing up the money that was coded to central just among all the kids and portioning it accordingly. But as we talked about at the last meeting, and we'll talk about again a little bit later this meeting, but at future meetings, that could be done in a lot of different ways, right? You could do it by staff member, you could do it by school type or things like that. And the question is whether or not the SEA is going to do that, or the LEA just wants to divvy up as much as it can to the school and then leave the rest as a chunk or whatever. And let's just keep that as a placeholder, because I think that could tip off another hour conversation for now. And we want to get through a few more things. But not the least of which is the team also looked at expenditures by object. And so this is a separate way of slicing the money. And you can see here that you could go with rolled up categories, or, are there certain objects that would be greater interest that, as a common reporting, we want to pull out certain objects. And again, this will ultimately relate back to questions about, what value does showing different kind of data have? Maybe there's a drop down, and under employee salaries, you have categories of different types of salaries, and that's where the really useful information is. If you look at salaries, salaries is the biggest number. And so is there a whole lot of information to be had by breaking out the non-salary stuff? We did the same thing on function code. And functions, again, instruction is the biggest number. And the question here is, when one category dwarfs the rest, is there still valuable information for the breakouts? Do we want to break out within instruction? Do we have a sense that there's reliable data, and what would we be using it for? And you'll see we sent out these Excel files, but the idea was to sort of get you to start doing it and see whether or not what was sort of decisions you faced while you're pulling information out. But that brought us back to this question of what's the goal, right? Like we said, if there's data for resource allocation or equity decisions, there's data for efficiency. So like, are people going to look at it and say, I should be spending less on this because my peers spend less on it, or whatever. Like, why are transportation costs so high? And then there are data on productivity. And so I'll tell you how we started to put these together, and see what you think about this. I think there's a lot of, I don't want to jump past a question from Kim.
Did you map functions and objects to federal directly? Katie, you might be able to answer this one.
Yeah, Kim, so are you, so for the functions and objects, we didn't break it out by federal or state and local.
Well, I was talking about, like, our instructions are 1,000, our support services are 2s, but for example, student transportation on our side is 3,510.
Oh yeah, I got you.
Oh, you did?
Yeah, so that's why we didn't break out student transportation for you. Yeah.
Okay, because I was like, because you have our non-instructional services as 31 million. We were wondering, does that include transportation or not? Or
gotcha. Yeah. So yeah, yours was a case where there's the same thing for debt, I think, or something else, and yours are transfers. Yeah. So we didn't break out things if they weren't listed in the 2000s. I didn't put it in, but these are just federal codes for useful of comparison. Yeah.
Okay. Gotcha.
I think part of the thinking was, like, if we were trying to do something in the area of common reporting, like, what could we really do? So that the idea is, well, maybe we just start with the federal account structure and see, like, what we learn or what we don't learn. And if it doesn't work, which is not going to work in a bunch of states, then, like, how do we go about doing this? Do we try to get everybody to have the same coding for transportation and get a number that we can compare? Is it worth it? To what end? That kind of thing. So then we went back to this. So what the goal, and what kind of data would give us answers to each of these types of questions? And for us, we went and said, okay, if that's the goal, we have equity, efficiency, and productivity, maybe. We know that there's no data if you don't start with kind of the base information, and plus this is going to be part of the federal law. But if you think of the base information, is that you need a total spending number on behalf of students at each school. So we're just going to have to figure that out. And to Weston's point and some of these other ideas, we're going to have to figure out what a student is and what a school is, so that we have that number. That would be that first box A. And we need the student counts. This is before we get into spending by student type, but we probably, you know, if people want to be able to compare these, they kind of need to know how many kids go there and what types of kids, if possible. And those are different data sources, as we mentioned. And then we can layer on different kinds of expenditure reports. We can do the expenditure by student type. We mentioned that's going to be a really hard box for a lot of people to complete. That was that green box that would maybe give us comparisons for equity, but really raised a lot of issues of what numbers to report and are they going to be consistent on expenditures by student type. We also noticed that, you know, if you pull out the expenditures by objects or function, that's the blue and the purple kind of boxes, D and E. That potentially allows you to make comparisons that can do the efficiency thing, right? Like, are we spending as much on transportation or student services or operations as our peers? There's some big boxes in there, things like salaries or instruction, that don't give us a whole lot of information in there, but that's where that goes. You go a different direction, and we did not do this today or with the data yet, but if you start that base data, you can go the route of pairing it with student outcomes data. And you're clearly going to have to adjust for student type. Maybe that's a box F. We did not show any box F today. We could all use the same source. There's a CETA data site called the Stanford Educational Data Archive that's putting together data on student outcomes and adjusting it by student type and percentile so that you can compare it across states where they're even giving different tests. And that allows you to start to make comparisons for productivity's sake, right? So you could go these different directions, or you could go multiple directions. And I think depending on your data set, you know, the green and the purple might be tough. The red, everybody should be able to do. And using that kind of base information with the red is not for nothing, right? That's super valuable data. Ultimately, you know, putting them all together is going to give you more options, more reports, more solutions and applications for if a school says, here's my school, I found another school that has really great outcomes, spends the same amount of money. The next question will be, how do they spend their money? Which means that they'll want to look, are they doing things similar to the way I'm doing and I just need to work harder? Or are they doing things that are really, really different? And maybe that's something I can consider or start to look into. So this is sort of how we laid this out. And I know it's a lot of information, but I want to stop here and see if you guys have any thoughts on that. Do you feel like you have a sense of the direction on where to go, or you want to work on all these things at the same time? Or we purposely didn't put these into tiers because we didn't want them to be sequential. You know, you could just start with your base information. It has nothing in the broken out by student type or by object or function, and you could pair that with the outcomes. At the same time, you could start to pull out more financial data and not go the route of the outcomes, or try to work on the minimal pieces along the way for each. So I thought that might be a place for you all to say, like, how are you thinking about this? Well, I know DQC is on, so maybe we'll unmute you and see if you want to weigh in at all on communications on this. One of the things I would say that we've learned is that if you talk about finance or financial data expenditures, and the only thing you talk about is efficiency or equity, it's actually pretty unpopular, even though those are noble goals for sure, that you might find that schools and systems will bristle and feel like this is kind of a negative thing imposed on them. When you talk about the productivity route, at least from a communication standpoint, people can get more excited and feel like there's something in it for them, and looking forward to it as a tool that they can use as a way to raise their student outcomes. And I didn't have any sense of what, you know, DQC might say on this issue if you were to think about this.
And Brennan, I'm not sure if you got the note. I tried to send you an audio pen so you could unmute, but sometimes if you're on by phone and not on your computer, it can be challenging. Oh, there it goes. We might be able to have gotten you.
Are you there?
Can you hear me?
Yay!
Yeah.
Yes.
Hi. Oh, good. Okay. Yes, I did get the audio pin. Thank you. Marguerite, you actually, as you were talking, took the words out of my mouth about the clear what's in it for me. And, you know, you're talking about at the school level, but I also wonder for state folks, I think ultimately some people are going to have some conversations with their legislatures and other state policymaker, political type people. And I agree that efficiency and equity might only work half the time, if that. So I think I'm really just singing from your same songbook here, and that's one of the things that I want to work on, is working with you guys to develop some clear value propositions for why people should care about putting this data out, period.
And I think we've heard some of that exact concerns, right, from those of you as you're trying to report. You're sort of anxious, like, if I report this, you know, somebody will use it wrong. If I report this, somebody will use it wrong or misinterpret it. And that anxiety or lack of full information might be about the sense that people are just going to go hammer districts on equity or efficiency alone. I'll give you one other example kind of on the efficiency. This was from Ohio from a couple of years ago, and I'm not sure if we have anyone from Ohio, and maybe you can speak to this, but we were looking through the data and we found a district that had some of the highest spending on administration, I think it was. And I may not be getting this story perfectly correct, but it's just an illustration. So it was a district that had some of the highest percent of its spending on administration. And so it kind of looked like it would flag, like, are they overspending on leadership somehow? They also had the highest relative outcomes. And so suddenly you're thinking, okay, well, if the goal is to put more money in the classroom, it's to what end? The school district has higher outcomes, right? Like maybe we should flip our thinking and say the goal is really higher outcomes on a relative basis, and not kind of the micromanaging of how you spend your money on each category. And so there's a way to kind of insulate districts to say, we're not releasing this data to sort of have you all chase down kind of the lowest spending per category, but really work on your end to try to chase even better outcomes on a relative basis. And knowing that you may not be there, but the data is a way to help you start thinking about it. And I know DQC was pretty clear about this early on. People have to trust the numbers before they can be used for accountability. So the goal here, and I think you might all want a message, is not accountability. The goal here is a tool that can be useful in a local kind of conversation way. Any other thoughts on that? That's helpful, Brennan. Thank you.
Deb with Illinois, I did go ahead and unmute you if you want to ask your question.
Well, what I've been thinking about here in Illinois and doing is, in our chart of accounts, we have a whole section that's on instruction, and then support services to the students, such as speech, psych services, social workers, such like that. So I was pulling all of those expenditures to the school level, basically, and then I'm coming up with what I'm calling, if you will, an ESSA tool for districts to report on. And a page of that includes what I'm calling the demographics, where the district's going to have to report the demographics for the school and how it relates to each, or the district and how it relates to each school, such as they're going to have to report how many special ed students they have in the schools, as well as for the district, and for the social worker, how many students does the social workers in the district meet with, speech, how many students they meet with, and so on. So then we know how to break that out, or how they can kind of cost it out to each school for those. But the instructional cost for in the classroom, the regular ed, special ed, and so forth like that, each school would have those exact expenditures. So that's how we're kind of thinking about it right now in Illinois, taking the instructional. Then the other cost, such as transportation for right now, transportation, hot lunch, administration of the superintendent's office or such like that, there would be the central level that's allocated to all schools.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that makes sense. I mean, these are the question for maybe some of the districts is, are they going to implement that with fidelity? Sort of how do they
Yeah.
do that?
Well,
what happens when you get to a school that's just different? They don't do any of those things, and so you're saying, here's what you do, and they say, but we don't, like, maybe there'll be a lot of charter schools who say that all your language doesn't even apply to us.
Well, quite honestly, for the charter schools, we're going to have to talk about that separately here in Illinois, because our school districts that enter into an agreement with a charter school, they pay tuition to that charter school, and we can easily identify the tuition they're paying to the charter school through that district's chart of accounts and expenditures that they give us, because we have a line item for that. So for that charter school, I was again thinking that that would be a separate school to which we would put those tuition payments over there and then divide by the number of charter schools. Now, understanding that we are not capturing all of that charter school's expenses either, but the district and that school is not incurring those other expenses that the charter school may be incurring. So we're going to have to talk about that. We also have charter schools in Illinois that are approved at the state level, to which there's no impact at all with any school district at all. We simply send them an apportionment of funding to that charter school. We do get the audits in of all charter schools in here, so we are going to have to talk about that to some further degree, but we can keep the charter schools separate and distinct.
Yeah, and I think this is why we wanted to kind of go back to this to what end question. And hopefully this to what end question, like you're trying to produce data that does what, that will be helpful on what. And if you think of that, it might guide your decisions on those. Like if I want really good efficiency comparisons, then I'm going to have to get like better numbers on object and function. If I want sort of like what are people spending by student type, and so I could start thinking about equity, and you can do equity without just that, even with rough data on that. But or do I want to look at productivity, then I'm also going to need to look at these outcomes. And then some of the smaller stuff may not matter as much, and maybe I'm a little looser. I just need a really good base information number at the top. So I've got two more quick things before we do a very fast survey for you all. But this is just a rundown, and we'll probably talk about this more at other meetings. There's a lot not captured in most SCA financial data sets. Like often, we talked about this, how and when a school coded expense gets coded in schools. Like how did that happen? How shared expenses are assigned? Should we divide them among all pupils or staff or population type? That the actual decisions around that don't often get included. And for those two especially, those might be defined in a chart of accounts, but they're often not, or they might be applied with local discretion. So that's an issue. You can see there's also this locus of control of expenditures. So we don't know, just because the money was sent to a school, if the school had control, if the people who are in there report to the principal or not. So that's not there. And then we hear that a lot about, I want this data because I want to know how much money they control. And that's really generally not in there. Or the nature of the programs offered, or the students that are served by specific expenses, that's really often not coded in there. And as we talked about, student counts are not in financial data sets. So there's going to be a lot of stuff. Just want to flag one other thing, is that the SCA could be the one to choose how to divide up the central money. And it could choose different methods depending on certain object or function codes, or it could let the LEAs choose. And that might be all part of a local conversation about how and why we assign you those costs, which might not be the worst thing. So there's a lot of options in there. So you don't necessarily have to say the SEA has to choose. You could push that back down to LEAs and say you choose, and talk about it with your people at the school level. So lastly, and I am a little bit rushing through this, and you may have to send these on emails, but you could type some comments in there. What of all this do you see as useful in a common reporting framework? Like, what do you want to be able to compare across states? We put a bunch of these boxes up today, A, B, C, D, E, F. I did not actually show you any student outcomes data, but there might be things like, well, I want to know how the expenses were divided up. Maybe I want to know the locus of control, and so on. But that's what we'll be kind of working on together. So feel free to type a comment in there or send us a note afterwards. But I want to make sure we leave at least a few minutes for the quick